right is still right, even if you stand by yourself.
Mr. Chief Justice, may it please the court.
Welcome to this week's episode of Case in Point, the legal show for regular people. I'm your host, Sarah Parshall Perry, a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington, D.C. We aren't, of course, your typical legal show, and I'm not your typical lawyer. That's because I'm a lot more fun, honestly, but it's also because I know the law can seem disconnected and really boring from everyday life. This is why you come to Case in Point. Our aim is to take away all the mystery and boredom surrounding the third branch of government, the judiciary, and show you why you need to care about legal developments across the country. On this week's episode of Case in Point, I'm going to be joined by Caroline Moore, who's the Vice President of Parents Defending Education. Why Parents Defending Education? Well, I'll tell you why, because most of the litigation that we're tracking across the country is taking space within the concept and context of American education. Not just public schools, but private schools too. What we're seeing is not only litigation over whether or not boys and girls should compete on different sports teams, but whether teachers and school administrators can actually hide the gender identity information of minor kids from their parents. Is that a violation of federal law? They also are going to tell us at PDE whether or not they have tools for you, the listener, to actually find out what your rights are and how bad things are within your specific school. We'll talk about their current litigation, their indoctrination map, and some pretty scary statistics about how many kids across the country are subject to school secrecy policies that their parents may not know anything about. So, in short order, here's Caroline Moore with Parents Defending Education. On this week's episode of Case in Points, the legal show for regular people, I am joined by Caroline Moore. Caroline Moore has worked for the Federalist Society. She's worked for the Republican Attorney General's Association. And right now, she is Vice President of Parents Defending Education. There is not another space in litigation right now, I think, that is more active than litigation based in and around the public education system. We've kind of seen an encroachment, not just on the fundamental parental right of parents to direct the care and education and upbringing of their parents, of their children, but also specifically because we've got an encroachment on, for example, incursions based on free speech. Can your student or you as an educator or administrator be forced to use a student's preferred pronouns? Well, the current Biden-Harris administration seems to believe that you can, but federal courts have indicated otherwise. So I am really excited to talk to Caroline today because Parents Defending Education is on the forefront of some of this really fast-paced litigation. So Caroline, welcome to Case in Point.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, so let's start a little bit with some of these preferred pronoun cases. And you and I have talked about that in the past. First, before we go into the actual litigation, can you tell me sort of the mission and purpose of Parents Defending Education?
Absolutely. So Parents Defending Education is a membership organization. We're a national organization, so we represent parents from all over the country. And what our sole purpose is, really, what was started as, is a litigation shop. So we want to represent parents. And through our organization, we do that parents can be anonymous. And so instead of Sarah and Caroline versus a school district, we can protect the anonymity of the parents by having it be Parents Defending Education versus said school district, because we know that, parents can be harassed, their kids can be harassed in schools, and no one wants that. If parents and their families are strong enough to come forward, we want to protect them.
It seems like there is a real market for this because for students who are in these public schools and parents who are invested in their kids' education, they don't want to make themselves a target by saying, we're the ones who were bringing a violation for First Amendment free speech rights based on this individual who, for example, believes that they're trans and wants the use of his or her preferred pronouns. That automatically sets up kind of a cultural clash that I think in a lot of respects, these kids are probably not suited to deal with. So do you find that there's a market for parents who want that anonymity?
Absolutely. All of our parents do. We allow parents to submit tips online anonymously, and then we'll file open records requests into these school districts so that the parents don't have to have their names attached to it. Once we do these open records requests, we often find that, there are problematic policies. It's not just, a teacher acting out, which I think people think. It's really, these are district policies that are pushed on the teachers, and they have to enforce these preferred pronouns.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you guys have a couple of different cases that intersect with that notion, right? So we understand the First Amendment not just protects your ability to communicate freely, but also prevents you from having to communicate something you don't believe, right? So it's sort of the affirmative and the passive right of free speech. And that includes symbolism, right? So you and I understand the West Virginia versus Barnett case in which the Supreme Court determined that to protest the war, it was the time of the Vietnam War, for example, students could wear black armbands as a form of silent protest against the Vietnam War. So we have just generations of jurisprudence protecting the free speech rights within public school. And in fact, one of the last opinions we saw in school free speech was a case that we've always referred to as the cussing cheerleader case, right? So this is BL versus Mahanoy Area School District. And that was a young woman who got cut from the cheerleading squad and went to social media on the corner of, a convenience store outside from her school, basically lighting up social media with the screen, as teenage girls are sort of
that's
want
kind of
to
what they do now.
That's
Yes.
exactly it. And Justice Breyer, before his retirement, said, classrooms are the nurseries of democracy. So even sort of the liberal lion, right? Somebody who was always leaning to the left on the Supreme Court recognized, listen, free speech rights are critical and no more so than within the public education context, because we're not trying to create little ideologues, although you'd be hard pressed to find anyone in current leadership who, sort of does not believe that. But this is really something that impacts not only the students themselves, but also the teachers and administrators, because they have a right to be prevented from having to communicate something that they believe, for example, is a lie. If you have a teacher, for example, who believes, listen, my religious beliefs tell me that males and females are created inerrantly, and that is how we're biologically wired. I don't want to lie to a student about his or her name or gender. Those teachers and administrators have First Amendment rights as well. So you guys have brought litigation in a couple of different places on these preferred pronoun policies. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
It's actually in the Sixth Circuit. And so that's outside of Columbus, Ohio, the school district. And so what we found in this district is that these harassment policies, they're really overbroad. And so parents don't know whether or not these policies will be implemented with their kids or they won't. And so the parents, their kids, they teach them truth and fact at home. So if you believe in this, you should speak up. If you want to wear a flag to school, you should wear a flag to school. And there is no reason under any circumstance you should use someone's preferred pronoun if it's not what you believe.
Yeah.
If it is a girl and you know that it is a girl, then why would you use, male pronouns?
Yeah.
And so that's mainly the process of that case. And, we lost at the district court level. But then we went up to the Sixth Circuit. And we had one really strong dissenting opinion. And so there's the Meriwether precedent, which we know about. And that's why, we thought that this circuit was very important to bring this case in. And so we're really hoping that we'll have an en banc decision soon. So that's our hope.
Yeah. And the Meriwether decision, it's a case called Meriwether versus Hartop. And it's one of my favorite in relation to educational freedom and free speech, because this was actually a professor, right? So the professor at Shawnee State University says, listen, I don't want to use the student's preferred pronouns. To me, that's considered a lie. And we got a great opinion from the Sixth Circuit that said, listen, you're forcing him to violate his beliefs and forcing him to say something that he believes very strongly on. And this is a matter of public concern. We want public debates on this. I mean, gender identity probably dominates, I would say, most of the litigation space right now. I mean, we're at a legal strategy forum. We've been talking about how these pieces fit together. As far as parents are concerned, this issue of free speech touches on all of these different manifestations of gender identity. So considering the fact that we've gotten a good outcome in the Sixth Circuit in this Merriweather versus Hartop decision, are you hopeful that the court in your case as well will come down the right way in favor of freedom of speech?
No, I mean, I think that's a good question. We really do believe that we will have a promising outcome in this decision. And so we're just hoping and waiting, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll hear back because, these judges have had that Merriweather decision. So we're very hopeful.
You've got another case. This is another free speech case. It's PDE versus Croton Harmon Union Free School District. Once again, we're talking about school, right? This is another free speech case and preferred pronoun use. Once again, these kind of are now kissing cousins, right? We're seeing the biggest encroachments on free speech within the context of gender identity. And suddenly children who are saying, I want this name, I am now this gender, I want these preferred pronouns. And you've got a clash of sort of individual representation. What they're saying are individual rights and free speech, for which the Supreme Court has been very clear for hundreds of years. As enumerated in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment really is something we want to protect. And when there are encroachments, you better have a really good reason. So tell me about your other lawsuit.
Yeah, so this is in upstate New York, and this school district passed a DEI policy that we thought was problematic. It infringes on free speech. And so we want to protect the students in that district. We've had parents come forward and say, hey, our kids don't feel comfortable speaking up for themselves, or, they don't feel comfortable wearing things, like I said, the American flag or anything like that in class because they're scared that they will be punished. And a lot of districts that we've found across the country, these two particularly, students can face being expelled for, not using preferred pronouns in these these classrooms. And it's ranging in, first grade to, senior in high school, which is, just so crazy because what does an elementary school student know about, pronouns? Yeah. They're learning actual pronouns.
Right.
And here we're pushing, we're teaching them the opposite in class, how to refer to kids. And so we're hopeful in this case. We're waiting on an opinion on it. So we're hopeful.
So DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We normally think of that within the concept of race-based school policies, right? Now it's taken off everywhere. We've seen it in corporate America. We've even seen it at NASDAQ when they introduced a new mandatory diversity platform for everyone who is on the board. We've seen it in education. We've seen it in hiring and firing. This is sort of, I think, a pernicious manifestation of how gender and race kind of get lumped in together to push through these incredibly restrictive school policies that winnow down individual rights, regardless of what the Supreme Court has said. So in that particular case, you've talked about preferred pronouns. Were there also race-related elements as part of that training?
Yes, absolutely. And I think like what you're saying is it's really a catch-all. Right? Like, I think that these harassment policies, they're so broad that yes, it can say that nice little diversity, equity, inclusion, but actually there are an additional, however many pages just dedicated to pronouns or whatever the issue may be. And so these are problematic policies that are being passed, but I don't even know that, school boards are reading them closely or that parents are being heard out in school board meetings. You know, a lot of school boards across the country, parents will reach out to us and say, we're only allowed to speak for 1 minute. Or if we're not one of the first 10 people to sign up, there's no way on earth, anybody will hear our concerns. Yeah. And so I think a lot of parents' comments and, issues that they're raising are going on deaf ears or not even, reaching the school boards. Yeah, that they can change the policies.
And it doesn't help that the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, specifically targeted parents for investigation because there was a purported increase in threats. What it was parents, I think, being righteously indignant because they've got sexually graphic material, race essentialism, mandatory pronouns, and parents are finally getting to the point, I think, where they've had enough. But now they need organizations like PDE to essentially provide them the legal shield that helps them actually enforce their rights. Because again, dealing with school boards, dealing with public education is like dealing with any other government agency. More or less bureaucratic within some contexts, but for people who want to make sure that they're protecting their children, making sure the material is age appropriate, and not giving the public school system the latitude to indoctrinate their children on, for example, a notion like gender identity, which these parents may have had conversations at home saying specifically, God made us male and female. This is the way, you are created. God doesn't make mistakes. Science determines whether you're a male or female. You're right in that you pointed out, kindergarten, first grade, we're talking 5, 6, 7-year-olds. These are babies. How are they supposed to determine in that sort of waiting between the authority figure in school or the authority figure of their parents, which one is right? I mean, you're setting up a clash of moralities that you could completely avoid by just saying, we're not going to discuss gender identity. That may be something, if ever appropriate, is more appropriate for, let's say, high school or college, but especially so in these formative years, which infuriates me, being the mother of 3 children. I mean, it really is kind of putting them to a real Hobson's choice.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the only thing I can akin it to is when you're an adult and you go and you work at an organization and maybe you don't necessarily believe in everything, your boss is telling you to do.
Yeah.
But when you're in school, I mean, these kids don't have that thought process, right? And I mean, we've talked to lots of parents who say, on Sundays, the kids wear crosses and they go to church. But, on Monday, we tell them, don't say anything weird, just, be quiet and just get through it. But, I think like what you're saying, you're really putting kids in a weird situation, and these conversations shouldn't be happening at the young grade levels, but, give parents a chance to have these one-on-one conversations with themselves, with the kids.
Yeah.
And wait until it's appropriate for, middle schoolers or high schoolers.
Yeah, when they're a little more fully developed and the parents have had the first pass at helping to cement and develop and teach a particular worldview, those values that are not just taught but caught in a home environment, right? I mean, there's a perfect order for this. Like parents not only have a constitutional right to direct the upbringing of their children, but they also have a God-given right. These are the kids that you've been stewarded, and you've got to make sure that if you have an opportunity, you teach them well, because the rest of the world is going to be very keen to limit their individual freedoms, to present this sort of victim, victor, oppressor, oppressed narrative. We find this so much in education right now, right? So a lot of this, and let me just go back to DEI for a second, is sort of representative of this. If you are white, you have inherent privilege. If you are white, you have inherent bias. I mean, other organizations that we've worked with in the past, Southeastern Legal Foundation, for example, found out that there were trainings that were being given out in Missouri, for example, for these teachers, and they had to raise their hands and say, I affirm that I am biased. I affirm that I have privilege. I'm thinking, if you looked at my bank account, you would not believe there was any privilege there whatsoever. But, it sets these kids up who are being taught not to see color, who are taught not to focus on gender, and just to love people equally according to the golden rule, or what Martin Luther King said, which is, I want my kids to be judged on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. You're taking all of that away. Now you're putting back into place this inherent racism that the entire civil rights movement worked so hard for. And even to a certain extent, the women's lib movement, right? In the 60s and 70s, because they gave us Title IX of the Education Amendment. So let's segue, because we're talking education, we're talking about some of this litigation, and let's talk about sort of another manifestation of where I think things are going in a really very complicated season to be educating your kids in public school. And the people who are listening will recognize the fact that in this past year, within April to August, the Biden administration released and then finalized for enforcement a new rule interpreting Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. Very short, very simple rule, very short, very simple statute. It just says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in education that's federally funded. Now, what happens if the government determines that sex is not just male and female, but sex is also gender identity, gender expression, pregnancy, sexual orientation? It sort of seems like you would be turning the paradigm of sex equality that helped us go to graduate school, get college degrees, succeed in scholastic athletics. You're kind of turning that on its head, aren't you?
Absolutely. No, and I think it opens schools up to so many lawsuits. I mean, on both sides. But no, I mean, by changing it from a sex issue to a gender identity, adding just those few words onto the Title IX, I mean, I think that it is going to be extraordinarily problematic. And I mean, we've seen, 26 states have sued. And so, I mean, that's promising if you live in one of those 26 states. We're a part of litigation with 4 of those states, and it's good for people who live in those states. But I mean, we need to represent all Americans. I mean, the whole purpose of Title IX was passed by Congress, done the right way, that protects females. Yeah. And now, I mean, just through, the regulatory process, you can just change the way the law is. And I mean, it's a complete overreach of the executive. It's scary.
Now, in your particular lawsuit, the lawsuit that Parents Defending Education is involved in over the new Title IX rule, what are some of the claims that you guys have advanced? What are some of the challenges on which your lawsuit rests?
Well, it's a due process issue, especially in higher ed. And then we also have fairness and let me think what else we have on there. Parental rights is also a claim. We, several of these. And I think ours is the most all-encompassing, we think, because of course we wrote it. Yeah. But, our great lawyers wrote it. But I think that, all of the different lawsuits bring about different claims. And I think that they're really good. So definitely.
And we got a good order at the Supreme Court that kind of was very big, but because parents are all getting ready for school, the irony is it went into enforcement. The rule went into enforcement August 1st. August 14th, the Supreme Court weighs in, issues what's called a per curiam order, right? Unsigned order, but all of the justices, and this is critical because we have a splintered Supreme Court. We've got sort of 6 conservative / centrists, and we have 3 real liberals, arch liberals, right? So these are not, maybe I'm going to go liberal this way, maybe conservative on another case. They're pretty consistently a block together in the way that they vote. But all 9 of the justices said, listen, these states are entitled to preliminary relief. We're going to pause the new rule because we all agree that these are super problematic provisions, including the provision that took sex and expanded it to gender identity. So I think we all kind of breathed a sigh of relief, but that wasn't what we call a merits determination, right? So we haven't gotten to the actual sort of meat of the lawsuit itself and those claims like a violation of due process, like a violation of First Amendment, like a violation of parental rights. They just issued a procedural order saying, okay, it's going to stay on pause for now while you guys continue litigating. Based on that order, are you kind of hopeful that when the Supreme Court gets the actual meat and potatoes of these cases, and there are 11 of them, again, 26 states have sued, are you hopeful that when the Supreme Court gets the sort of meat and potatoes arguments that they're going to come down the right way?
Oh, absolutely. I think like what you said, that all 9 justices could agree on something. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, that never happens. And so, that, I mean, they obviously are like red flags everywhere. There's something wrong with this. Yeah. And so, no, we're definitely hopeful. And, all of these cases are now having oral arguments. I think we heard earlier today, I think there are a couple oral arguments in the next week or so. And so that's incredible. So once we hear back on those cases, I mean, I think it'll be really good for parents of females, but honestly, parents of all children.
Yeah,
in this country.
The Title IX statute that's been around for 52 years protects boys and girls equally, men and women equally, right? Equal athletic opportunity, equal private spaces, equal housing opportunities, equal scholarships. It makes sense. If Congress had wanted to amend Title IX to include gender identity or expression, they had multiple opportunities. 1975, when they enacted the regulations, 1987 with the Civil Rights Restoration Act, that did not ever lead to a modification of the law. So the law is the way Congress determined it to be, right? It is the purview of the Supreme Court to say what the law is, but making the law is Congress's job. That's not something for an executive agency like the Department of Education. I would not be surprised if we don't see an actual merits determination, that meat and potatoes type determination where they take all the litigation and look at it before the end of the term, because we have simply now just kicked off the Supreme Court term for fall 2024. We've already gotten this order. We know there are quite a number of cases at the Supreme Court specifically related to, for example, gender identity, also women's sports. I would not be surprised if we get a determination before the end of the term on this particular issue.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. And I think that's kind of unfortunate for parents, because I think a lot of the parents we talk to are thinking, oh gosh, if it went up, it's we'll hear back next week, you know? And so I think that's one troubling thing with parents is they don't quite understand, or maybe a lot do, but a lot of parents that I talk with don't really get that it won't be a split second decision, because they know how important it is in their lives. So they think that that's the only thing going on. Unfortunately, with this country, there are a lot of things at play. Yeah. So, we don't get the decisions as quickly as we want, but it's not necessarily that you want them quickly. You want them to be the right decisions.
Correct. Yeah. So your organization, we talked a little bit about litigation, but you've got other tools that are incredibly helpful. And first of all, we talked about this. My colleague and I both mentioned this. I commend it. It is the Parental indoctrination map, the school indoctrination map. Explain that resource and where parents can find it, because I have to tell you, even in my own research and writing, my own legal research and writing, I've been able to track what are called school secrecy policies. And these are policies where school boards, school districts, schools themselves enact policies that say, if your minor child, Johnny or Jane, comes to school and says that they are suddenly a boy or a girl, we're not going to tell you. Yes, it's your minor child. Yes, we need a parental permission slip for a field trip. Yes, we need a medicine slip for a Tylenol. But if your child comes to school and says, suddenly I believe that I am a girl today, we're not going to tell you. So that is something related to this indoctrination map.
Oh, absolutely. So our website's defendinged.org for anybody listening. We have a lot of great tools on there. We have an indoctrination map, which kind of cites the bad things that are going on across the country. And it is a map format. So you can click on your state, your area, and get to the source of issues in your area. But we also have this gender nonconforming list, which is a list of policies in school districts by state that you click on your school district and it'll pull up the exact policy that exists in your school that tells teachers, you should work behind the backs of parents to, affirm a child, whether it's a social change or connect them with a healthcare professional so that, they can get, either have a consultation with a doctor or get a chest binder, or all of these things that we think are so far out of reach for children. Yeah. But actually, when the school districts are directing teachers to work behind the backs of parents, these things could be happening and parents have absolutely no idea that their child is even thinking about this. And the child may not be, but it's something that's being pushed on them. Yeah.
And 12 million students and growing are now subject to these policies at their particular school. When I realized the impact of a number that size, it really floored me, because I realized how many kids are being encouraged to not communicate with parents, to not be open with parents, to not express what they might be feeling or thinking to their parents. And we talked today about the fact that organizations like the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH for people who are in the gender space, has actually admitted that if you socially transition someone, right? So you change clothes, change pronouns, change appearance, change bathroom use, you've actually started them on the road to medical transition, which means we're looking at a generation of kids who are more likely not just to experience the impact from a mental health standpoint of sort of these gender transitions, but also to be down a path that will chemically or surgically castrate them, preventing them from ever being able to conceive, from nursing if they're young women. And everything has increased from that with the complications like kidney cancer, bone cancer, cholesterol impact, mental health impact. So these school secrecy policies, I think, are like truly a camel's nose in the tent on gender identity, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's so troubling because, like what you said, these surgeries, I mean, it's not just, fixing a scrape on someone's arm, with a couple stitches or something.
Yeah.
These are the most complicated surgeries that anyone could ever go through. And to put a kid down that path without parental involvement is just, it's very scary to me.
Yeah.
And I mean, I went to public school, and when I did, I mean, it was parents working with teachers to get their kid to either pass or do better in math or get them in accelerated programs if they're good at something, as opposed to, we don't even want a parent in a classroom. Oh gosh, we don't want them to read aloud because what books are the parents, are they going to question what we're reading to the kids or whatever? And so I think that now there's this whole policy of we want parents at an arm's length, and that's, really scary. So parents, I mean, we tell them they've got to stay involved and get involved, know your kid's teacher, because it's so much easier to approach someone if something is going wrong, or you find out by asking your kid, how was school today? And they tell you some strange, lesson they learned about, their white privilege.
Right.
If you are actually talking to a teacher who you actually have a relationship with, there's a lot more promise in that, as opposed to, it's a stranger, you come in with a list of grievances. I mean, nobody wants to talk to someone like that. So a parent needs to get involved from, early on in the year.
Yeah. And something to mention to listeners who have kids right now in education, and I don't think a lot of parents understand this, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA. Remember, this was George Bush's sort of like major educational push, guarantees a right to come into your classroom, your child's classroom, observe that classroom, to have a parent-teacher conference, to be given an opportunity to examine curriculum. I think parents don't understand exactly how much they have in terms of weaponry to fight back on a lot of this indoctrination. And I hate to even use the word weaponry, because my mother is an educator, and my grandfather was a professor. I was a product of public school, loved the public school education program, and had to start my boys in public school because they needed specialized education services under different education civil rights laws. But I hate to put it in that adversarial context, but what are our options? I mean, we really have to get to a point where we tell parents, listen, guys, this is not time for cowardice. It's time for courage and character, because your child's worldview, their perspective on themselves, on right and wrong, oppressor, oppressed, equality, colorblindness, those are high stakes games, and all of that's on the line.
No, absolutely. And I think, like what you said, a lot of parents don't know what tools they have at their disposal. I mean, earlier we were talking about FERPA, and I mean, every parent has the right to see their child's education, their folder of, what classes they're in, what their gender identity. I mean, every parent has access to that.
Yeah.
If the child is under 18, but a lot of parents don't even know about that.
Yeah.
And so we try to create toolkits for back to school night and that type of thing. It's halfway through the year. These are things that you should be thinking about.
Yeah.
Because, parents have a lot on their plate, whether they're, working multiple jobs or working one job, and the spouses, are just trying to make it to soccer games. They're just trying to, survive. So we try to prepare these toolkits so that parents can think about things, maybe they don't have time to sit at home and ponder for hours.
Yeah.
Especially if their kid doesn't seem like they have, educational barriers they're overcoming or whatever.
So we talked a little bit about tools. So this goes to my last question, because you guys actually have sort of a twofold process in other aspects that aren't automatically directly related to litigation. We've talked a little bit, you and I, offline about what are called FOIAs, a Freedom of Information Act request. Tell me how that process works, and how would it benefit your average everyday parent who wants information about what the school's doing?
Oh, absolutely. So, like I said, parents can submit tips online, and we do this ourselves. Parents can also do it. You reach out to the school district and you find out who their Freedom of Information request officer is. It's usually, an administrative person in a school district. And you reach out and you can say a variety of terms. I'm interested in XYZ, whatever your issue is in the school district. You're worried about a gender transition plan, or you're interested in your child's curriculum on history in ninth grade, or whatever the issue may be, if you're not getting these things readily from the teacher or the educator, school district. And then the school district has to respond and say, hey, we have a certain amount of emails that use this term, and they send it back to you. And then you can some things will be blacked out, which is fine. It's personal information usually. But you can figure out, wait, what are these lesson plans? And you actually can get access to them if you can't do that on your own. A lot of school districts say, oh, we can't share a curriculum because there's a copyright issue. Well, filing these FOIAs, you can figure out what the policies are in the school district, what the curriculum, the lessons plan actually say. And so for parents who, have time and are interested in figuring out, that you think something is off, but you aren't sure what it is, we tell people definitely file FOIAs. And if they don't want to, we file them all the time. So your listeners can reach out to us, and we are more than happy to look into school district policies. That's how we came up with all of these gender nonconforming policies in the school districts. Is if you reach out, they're a public entity. They're funded by the federal government, so they have to respond to taxpayers.
Yeah. So you file a Freedom of Information Act request, and though it is painful oftentimes to produce all those records for the school, it is definitely an invaluable tool and part of what you guys do at PDE.
Absolutely.
Caroline, thank you so much for coming on Case in Point. Thank you for all of the work you're doing. Thanks for the tools you provide on your website, the litigation, the FOIA requests, and the opportunity to just work for average, everyday Americans who just want their kids to read and do arithmetic. It is truly, I think, an incredibly high calling, and you guys have risen to the challenge.
Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Case in Point. We're hoping you learned something. You were prompted to think critically. You identify some tools that you might be able to use in your own education format to protect your kids, and possibly even entertained a little bit along the way. Be sure to catch this week's and future episodes of Case in Point on all your favorite podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Rumble. And like and follow us on Case in Point Pod on the X platform. Also, share the show with your friends who could use a little law in their lives. And until next time, friends, court is adjourned.